Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for agreeing to this sort of curtailed, unusual arrangement for lunch, so we can proceed with our program. And before I introduce our speaker for lunch, I do want to note that in the last session today, Haitham Mana has agreed to also offer comments. That's our concluding panel this afternoon. So that isn't currently reflected on your schedule, but he will be offering some comments as well. So we'll have some more discussion of the Syria case. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to introduce a distinguished scholar and friend, Sadek Jalal Azam, who is very well known to many of you, a leading intellectual voice in the Arab world, a man who has provoked controversy for much of his intellectual life, perhaps best known in previous decades for his self-critique as Naqd Zati Ba'd al-Hazima, the self-criticism after the defeat of 1967, which was published in 1968. And in the 1960s, you also published a critique of religious thought, which created tremendous amount of discussion and controversy. I think you even spent a bit of time behind bars for that, if I'm not mistaken.
It's being translated now.
It's being translated now, finally. Finally.
Now, finally.
Yes, indeed. Ya Wallahi, okay.
Thanks to Al-Qaeda.
Okay. And Sadek Jalal Azam has continued provoking us. He's a leading voice for secularist ideals and for questions of personal rights and freedom in the Arab world. He's also offered a very significant critique of a very famous book by Edward Said, Orientalism, accusing, among other things, Said of practicing the same kind of reductionism in dealing with the West that he accuses Orientalists of adopting vis-a-vis the East. He's agreed to speak to us today for a short period, for 15 minutes or so, and we'll have time for just a couple of questions, but hopefully throughout the day we'll have opportunities in the break in the afternoon, and excuse me, and maybe also in the wrap-up session to come back to some of these lingering questions and debates. So, Sadek, it's my pleasure that you're with us today, and I'll sit next to you if you don't mind, and look forward to hearing everything you have to say.
Thank you very much, Dick, for your generous introduction. And I'm, happy you are next to me to help. First of all, I permit myself to start by making some comments on what I heard this morning about the Haytham's road plan. Now, the concept of the road plan came into circulation in connection with the Palestinians and the Palestinian problem. And 5, 6, maybe road plans have passed in the last, I don't know, maybe 10 years. And they came to nothing. And I really see no reason why Haytham's or anybody else's road plan, prefabricated road plan for Syria is going to fare any better than the prefabricated road plans for Palestine and the solving of the Palestinian-Israeli problem. Another point is about, let's remind ourselves that after the October War, when Henry Kissinger was very active in the Middle East, the road plan didn't exist at that time, but Geneva existed. And all the talk and discussion and expectations were concentrated on a Geneva Conference that was supposed to, again, bring the Palestinians and the Israelis and settle the issue. But in spite of all that, nothing happened at Geneva, and that never materialized. And again, I don't see any good reasons why Syria's Geneva should be any better than Palestine's Geneva. And of course, I'm sure the Palestinians remember that period very well. Concerning Egypt, now, one very striking thing about what happened in Egypt is the following. We all know that Egypt is a very, very religious society. The Egyptians are a very pious lot. And even the most sophisticated of Egyptian intellectuals cannot speak in Arabic, not in English, for 10 minutes without religion intruding into their discourse. And sometimes I get the impression that all Egypt and its problems are ala Allah. Ala Bab Allah. Okay. So, for these millions of pious, religious Egyptians to come out and reject Morsi and reject the Muslim Brothers is, I think, a absolutely stunning and unprecedented event in the history of not just Egypt, but also of the contemporary Arab world. The second observation I have coming out from what Dr. Hamzawi said. Also, I was, like a lot of others, struck very strongly by the amount of anger, disdain, contempt that poured out of Egypt against the Muslim Brothers and against Morsi. It was from outside absolutely stunning, the outpouring of this anger and disdain and contempt for the rule of the Muslim Brothers and and Morsi himself. And that, I think, requires some investigation and perhaps explanation. Finally, I think Dr. Hamzawi said nothing about the problem of Sinai, what is going now on in Sinai, and the role of what is going on Sinai as in bringing about the kind of decline and retreat that he spoke about, the sliding back, and especially the suspicions of collusion between the Muslim Brothers and the Morsi regime with what is going on in Sinai, and also what is going on in Sinai, that the attacks that happened against the Egyptian army, I think, played a very important role in what Hamzawi described. And especially those 16 or 18 soldiers that were killed in Ramadan, eating their, iftar at the end of the day. And Morsi had promised that all this will be brought up publicly, openly, the information about the perpetrators and so on. And of course, nothing happened as usual. And this is nothing special to Egypt and so on. This is how it goes in the Arab world. About the new generation, I belong to the same generation that failed, that was described, and I agree that we should step aside and have the new generation come forward. But I was astounded also that in Tunis, after the Jasmine Revolution, after the Youth Revolution, the first prime minister was 80 years old, okay? And now the prime minister who is supposed to break the stalemate in Tunisia is 88 years old. So, so I don't know how to explain these paradoxes. Uh, now, to the question, when was the Arab world as turbulent as today? Maybe there are some good answers to that question, which was directed to a historian. I am not a historian. But maybe the 1919 revolution in Egypt is a good candidate for that, which was so well documented in the in the literature of Najib Mahfouz. Another one would be after 1945, the Palestine problem and the coup d'etats that resulted after the Nakba of 1948 and the restlessness in the Arab world. So these could be, candidates for answering the question of turbulent moments like we are going through now in the Arab world. My next point is the title of this conference has something to do with the accomplishments of the Arab uprisings. But nothing was said about accomplishments, and even the word accomplishments was not used. So I would like to comment a little bit on this matter. The status quo was mentioned, and the continuation of the status quo. Well, the status quo immediately before the eruption of the Arab Spring and the uprisings was dominated by a very strong sense of Arab blockage, stagnation, estrangement, decay, drift, purposelessness, and so on. It was something like, especially in the key states that of the uprising, it was something like being inside Max Weber's iron cage. Now, I think the Arab Spring did something here. It broke that cage. It opened a new horizon. It removed obstacles and started processes of change, which really there is no way of predicting where they will lead and how far they will go. And I would regard that as one accomplishment, important accomplishment of the uprisings and of the Arab Spring. The defeat of the dynastic principle of Arab presidents passing power to their offsprings and family members is another important accomplishment of the Arab Spring and the uprisings. That meant the other side of the coin is that the dynastic principle is defeated. The other side of the coin is the rise of the principle of electoral circulation of power, which was all encapsulated in, you remember, لا تمديد, لا تجديد, لا توريث, which means no, these are the three no's, okay? No to the mechanical extension of the president's power, no to the automatic renewal of the tenure of the president, and no to the irrepressible desire of presidents to pass power to their sons. I think this is another, important accomplishment of the Arab Spring. For the first time ever in modern Arab and contemporary political history and political protest movements, we see the charisma of the revolutionary moment shifting from the usual Arab concentration on single leaders, unrivaled zaims, and so on, shifting to the flow and diffusion of the revolutionary masses in places like the Tahrir squares. I think this is a, something that for a long time has not happened. In other words, the Tahrir Square and the masses became themselves the charismatic moment of the revolution rather than the concentration on be it Sisi or Nasser or anyone else. Of course, I can mention, the huge participation of women in societies that are very conservative and in cities that are extremely prudish. Still, they were in huge number. A third or fourth accomplishment is that for the first time again in the history of Arab political protest, we have forms of art, innovative types of expression, music, performances, songs, plays, dances, balloons, prayers, satirical cartoons, sarcastic comments, and critical graffiti. Traditionally, Arab demonstrations and Arab protests never came near these. These were regarded as trifles or as a distraction rather than as part of the political protest operation itself. Again, I say all this was new to Arab political protest, to mass movements and mass demonstrations. In fact, I found that in this atmosphere, especially in Egypt, there was something carnivalesque. It was almost like a carnival. And that's, again, for the first time in our history. Okay? In other words, the Tahrir Square were carnivalesque in the sense in which Bakhtin spoke about carnival as a challenge to the pretensions of high power and the pretensions of high oppression, okay, as something that for the first time has entered our political life in the uprisings of the Arab Spring. Let me say something about Syria. For Syria, the Arab Spring and the Arab uprisings simply mean retrieving, getting back the republic from the usurping dynasty. In other words, getting back the Syria that we know when it was established from the kind of dynastic rule that it has evolved, and to get back the republic by fair means if possible, by foul means if necessary. And this is what is actually happening right now. Now, the international discourse on Syria tends to sublimate Syria to grand geopolitics, high strategy, the game of nations, power conflicts between the big states and countries, without too much attention to the internal springs and dynamics of the revolution itself. That I think something that should be, again, emphasized. Now, unfortunately, a segment of the left, both the Arab left and the international left, they buy into this version of sublimating Syria into a detail in the grand game of nations. By the left here doesn't see just a game of nations. The left sees a universal Western imperialist plot or conspiracy against the only regime in the area that still stands up to Israel and remains a stumbling block to imperialism and so on. Now, this way, of course, Syria simply for both narratives becomes really just the Syrian revolt becomes only a pawn in this grand game of nation, while the reality of oppression, and I emphasize the reality of oppression, gets either dismissed, neglected, or not taken account of. And I think the reality of oppression is very important if we want to understand what is going on in Syria and also in, of course, the other Arab uprisings. And this is why I would say that it is quite inaccurate to describe what is going on in Syria as a civil war, which it seems that everybody says this is what it is. Here I will take two examples of the nearest civil wars to us, Lebanon and Iraq. In Lebanon, the state was sidelined. There was, was very marginal, was on the side. And it was the communities that were mobilized and fighting each other. It was Druze against Maronites, for example. Okay. In Iraq, the state had been dissolved by the occupation. And again, it was the Shia community and the Sunni community, and of course the Kurds have their own agenda, who were mobilized and were attacking each other. This is not the situation in Syria. Okay. The Druze are not attacking the Sunnah of Horan. And the Sunnah of Syria are not preparing to invade Ismaili territory or to invade Christian territory. On the contrary, many of these communities are relatively calm, and they have received a lot of displaced persons from all over Syria, and are, of course, helping them as human beings, co-citizens, compatriots, and so on. If a historical analogy is needed here to understand what's going on in Syria, I would suggest that the Hungarian revolt against the Stalinist regime in 1956 is the right analogy. And as you know, the Hungarian armed revolt was crushed by Russian tanks, and this is exactly what is happening in Syria as well. No one said about the Hungarian armed revolt against the Stalinist regime that this was a civil war. No one said that this is a matter where Hungarian is killing Hungarian or a Hungarian is fighting Hungarian. Okay? I think the same logic should be applied to Syria. And the regime that we have in Syria has enough fascist element and enough Stalinist element. The Stalinist elements came from East Germany, from Ceausescu's Romania, and so on, to justify the analogy. Now, also in the international discourse on Syria, the emphasis is on protecting the rights of the minorities. All the time, the discussion gets repeated: the Kurds, Christians, Alawis, Druze, Ismailis, and so on. But this is taking place at a time when the Sunni Arab majority of the country is being destroyed. the Sunni Arab majority is getting a savage beating from the stormtroops, militias, and Scud missiles of the regime. Unlike Lebanon and Iraq, the main actor here in this conflict is the state itself, the power structure itself, its stormtroops, and its Praetorian Guard. Okay? And this is why I wouldn't say that it is, a civil war compared, say, to what happened in Iraq or compared to what happened in Lebanon. Now, we all know that all the villages, the towns, the cities, the city quarters that have been bombed, destroyed, that have been razed to the ground very often are of the Sunni Arab majority. The minority communities, villages, towns, cities, and so on, remain relatively calm. Out of the 120,000 or so killed, the wounded, the permanently impaired, the disappeared, the tortured, imprisoned, and so on, are the absolute majority of them are from the Sunni Arab majority of Syria. So there is something, of cynical arrogance, in simply emphasizing, on the question of the minorities when all this is taking place and happening in the country. And the silent assumption being here as if the Sunni majority is just waiting for the moment to attack and oppress the minorities of the country, which I think is completely a false assumption. Finally, the talk about the stalemate, that we are now in a condition of stalemate. That's a very static way of approaching the situation. We have to be more dynamic to take into account the past and, to some extent, the future. Now, the Syrian power structure of the mukhabarat, the military, and state apparatuses regarded themselves as an invincible granite block that anything that bumps into it will crumble into pieces. They would tell people like Michel Kilo when he is out of jail, why do you bother? We have a will of steel. We are made out of, tough iron and so on, and that we can crush anything in front of us or before us or that bothers us. Well, look at them now. All right. Look at the stalemate. They started from this position. The revolution started from nothing. And still we speak about a stalemate. I think there is something of deceptive about the idea of a stalemate when we think about from where the revolution started and from where the regime had started. And of course, the revolution has been able, at great sacrifice, to really reduce this granite block to a shadow of itself, actually to the point where Bashar has to call in Hezbollah, Shi'i militias and paramilitary fighting formations from Iraq and from Iran in order to be able to hold as much as he can on power. Finally, the question of extremism. Unfortunately, extremism is always attributed to the opposition. Nobody speaks about the extremism of the regime itself, of what it is doing. They showered their people with poison gas, and no one spoke about their extremism, And I think whatever extremism has come out of the revolution is trivial compared to the systematic, well planned and on purpose extremism of the regime itself. Thank you very much.
In the interest of the economy of time, I'm going to suggest that we collect 2 or 3 questions and give Sadek a few moments to respond to them. Who would like to begin? Yes, let me, Carl, would you pass the microphone back? Thank you very much.
I agree 100%.
Excuse me, I must tell you, my hearing is
Abla, my name is Abla.
Abla, okay,
And
my hearing
I'm
is no
actually,
good, so
I
have
want to emphasize that
Agrees with
whatever
you.
you said about Syria is very true.
She
And
agrees
people
with
are
what you say
suffering
about
every
Syria.
day, not only from the, well, it was one thing, that bombing of the usage of the chemical weapons.
Yes.
It's much more killing by haphazardly and making people, depriving people from food. Those people who are in the areas supposedly opposition are deprived from food. The regime has been horrible.
Yeah, the regime
well,
is not-
certainly it is not by chemical weapons alone that man dies in Syria.
Thank you.
Yes.
They
Yes. May we pass the microphone just behind Carol Murphy? Yep. Sorry to exploit your presence here, Carol.
Dr. Al-Azm, thank you for this very, very critical way of assessing the Syrian situation. The only comment I would like to make, and I see if you could elaborate on it, if the Hungarian model or experience is the one to compare Syria with, that's also very tragic because that Hungarian revolution was crushed. And we should be also expecting possibly maybe that one of the options that might happen in Syria. The question I have in mind is, and I'm not really convinced 100% this is not a civil war, because the regime had, those soldiers and those partisans and those who are fighting the opposition come from segment of Syrian society. How could we account for that? I mean, beyond saying that this is really the apparatus and the state supporters and so, we still have to address that segment of Syrian society still stands by the regime, unless that's the assumption you think is
No, I think this is very, to say that Syrian society, after all this, stands with the regime, I think is
segment.
way out.
No, segment. I said segment of Syrian society is still, is this true or not? I mean, we don't want to know that.
You said stagnant?
Segments, part
Segments.
of it.
Segments, yes. But those segments, most of the time, are not bearing arms to fight with the regime. At best, they protect their own turf. In other words, the Druze are not carrying arms to fight for the regime. The Kurds, except for the PKK, Syrian PKK, are not carrying arms to fight for the regime. Certainly, the Christians are not doing that. The Ismailis are not doing that, and so on. So, at best, they are in a neutral position, and according to some reports, seeing atrocities that are happening, okay, their sentiments at least are shifting more in the direction of against, if not for the revolution, against the revolution. On the Hungarian example, of course, in principle, any revolution can fail. I mean, this is not, I accept that. There are no pre-given guarantees for any historical movement that it should necessarily succeed, okay? But I think some conditions, I mean, the Russians could send their tanks directly into Hungary, okay? Here they have to do it at the hands of Syrians and Iranians and so on. And this is one, of course, difference in favor of the revolution in Syria. And I think after 2.5 years, if they couldn't crush it, I think the chances that they will be able really to crush it are now, nearing zero.
We have a lot more to discuss, and I must say, I really feel compelled to add. I remember discussions at meetings in Washington talking about Iraq, when a number of us were talking about what was going on in Iraq as a civil war. And I remember U.S. colleagues having in mind something like the American Civil War, saying, no, this isn't really a civil war. And these are all special cases in a sense. But certainly, it seems to me the empirical evidence is clear that Syrians are killing Syrians. And even though the regime, Sadek, may have, if you will, significantly reduced support, you still have significant numbers of Syrians supporting the regime and killing with the excuse of the regime, with the blessing of the regime, on behalf of the regime. And at base, it seems to me, a civil war is a war in which the people of the same nation are killing each other. And whether they're doing this in the context of a significant majority being opposed by a minority, a situation of much more, if you will, sectarian balance and pluralities and that kind of thing, it seems to me at base, it's kind of begging the question to say this isn't a civil war. It seems to me most certainly that it is.
I don't think so, because is there a revolution in which there was not something you are attacking, something you are revolting against, something you want to overthrow, and that thing you want to overthrow that you are attacking is from you, okay? Take any revolution, all right? Many, can be example, but there is always a counter-revolution or a regime that you want to overthrow, and that is part of you, all right? So merely saying that Syrian is killing Syrian, okay, turns it into a civil war. I mean, that's, I think, a very primitive definition of civil war, all right? Rather than what is happening in Syria is, a systematic attack from the stormtroops of and I insist stormtroops, okay, because most of the army is finished, okay? There is not much army left in Syria, and whoever soldiers are, the recruits are running away, and the defections and all that. So it remains really just the stormtroops of the regime that are doing the fighting. Otherwise, he wouldn't have not needed militias like Hezbollah and Liwa al-Abbas and so on.
Well, you've given us the ropes of the debate, so we'll continue pulling on those ropes, I'm sure, throughout the day. Unfortunately, we need to move on, so I'm going to turn over not the gavel, so to speak, not to my son, but to Raisa Leila for the next panel. Thank you very much, Sadek.
Okay.